The MV Sanko Harvest, a 76,000 deadweight ton bulk carrier launched in 1998 at a shipyard in Ulsan, South Korea, pulls away from the grain terminal at Paranagua, Brazil, in March 2023. Her holds packed with 68,000 tons of soybeans bound for Qingdao. Her captain, 22 years at sea, has no idea this crossing, 41 days across 2 oceans, will be her last paying voyage. Neither does the crew of 19. Sweating through engine checks in a room that still burns 32 tons of heavy fuel oil daily. But 3 floors up, in a chartering office in Singapore, someone already knows. The vessel's owner, a mid-sized Greek shipping firm, has quietly stopped bidding her into future charters. No fixture beyond this delivery. No renewal on her time charter party. The decision was made 6 weeks earlier, after a routine inspection in Rotterdam flagged corrosion exceeding 20% of original steel thickness across 3 cargo holds. 25 years old, she has outlived her Panamax classmates by nearly a decade. Her book value on the company's ledger reads $2.1 million, a fraction of the $34 million she cost new. Once she unloads in Qingdao on May 3rd, she'll sit idle at anchor off Jiaoshan for 11 days while brokers quietly shop her fate. The soybeans she carries will feed livestock across Shandong province within weeks. The ship that carried them will feed something else entirely. A beach, a furnace, a second life as rebar. But that's not yet decided. First, the numbers. Every ship's ending begins not with rust or age, but with arithmetic. Fuel burned against freight earned, repair bills against remaining years. For the Sanko Harvest, that arithmetic has already turned negative. What follows over the next 12 months is a process repeated roughly 900 times a year across the global fleet. The quiet transition from working asset to depreciating liability, and finally, to raw material. This is how a cargo ship dies. Not suddenly, but through a slow accumulation of costs no one outside a chartering office ever sees. Every 5 years, classification rules force a ship into dry dock for a special survey. A floating inspection where hull plating, ballast tanks, and cargo holds are measured down to the millimeter with ultrasonic gauges. For the Sanko Harvest, her 4th special survey, due in April 2023, was projected to cost $1.8 million. Steel renewal across 340 square meters of wasted plating, tail shaft withdrawal, and replacement of ballast tank coatings that had already failed inspection twice. Class rules under DNV allow up to 25% wastage on some structural members before renewal becomes mandatory. Her holds measured 22% on the worst frames. Technically compliant, but close enough that surveyors flagged a follow-up inspection within 18 months, not 5 years. That follow-up alone would cost another $400,000. Meanwhile, her daily operating expenses told their own story. At 22 years old, she burned 4.2 tons more fuel per day than a modern eco-design bulker of the same size, translating to roughly $2,400 in extra fuel costs daily at 2023 prices near $580 per ton. Against a charter rate of $14,500 per day on the Brazil-China grain route, after crewing costs of $2,100 daily, insurance premiums of $340 daily, and port fees, her net daily margin had shrunk to under $1,900, barely covering the amortized cost of the coming dry dock bill. Owners run a simple model. Total repair and compliance costs divided by remaining trading years, weighed against projected freight income. For ships under 15 years old, that math almost always favors continued operation. Past 20, it becomes a coin flip. Past 25, brokers say, the coin is usually already decided. The Sanko Harvest's model returned a stark number: $2.2 million in required investment against a projected 30 months of remaining economic life, at a time when scrap buyers were already offering $410 per light displacement ton. Cash, no survey required, no dry dock, no risk. The math had spoken. But dry dock surveys were only half the equation. A second force, harder to negotiate with than corrosion, was already closing in: international regulation and the rules that don't bend for aging steel. On January 1st, 2020, the IMO's global sulfur cap took effect, slashing permitted fuel sulfur content from 3.5% to 0.5% across international waters. For ships built before 2010, compliance meant one of 3 costly paths: install a scrubber system at $3.5 million, switch permanently to low-sulfur fuel at a 40% price premium, or retrofit engines entirely. The Sanco Harvest's owners chose the cheaper route, compliant fuel, accepting higher running costs rather than capital investment in a ship already nearing retirement. Then came ballast water. Under the Ballast Water Management Convention, fully enforced by September 2024, every vessel needed a certified treatment system capable of processing thousands of cubic meters of seawater through UV or chemical disinfection before discharge. Installing one aboard a 25-year-old bulker meant estimated costs of $850,000 plus 45 days of yard time the ship wouldn't be earning. Her existing system, installed in 2019 as an early compliance measure, was already flagged by DNV surveyors for corrosion in its filtration housing, a defect requiring $120,000 in repairs just to remain certified through her next intermediate survey. Insurance told the same story. Her Protection and Indemnity Club, renewing coverage each February, had raised her premium by 18% year over year, citing hull age and a minor grounding incident in 2021 off Ningbo. Underwriters increasingly price risk not just on a ship's history, but on statistical tables. Vessels over 20 years old account for roughly 12% of the world fleet, but nearly 30% of total losses by tonnage, according to Lloyd's List data. One failed structural inspection, one denied class certificate, and a ship becomes uninsurable and unchartered within weeks, dead in the water, legally speaking, long before she's physically scrapped. For the Sanco Harvest, the Classification Society's verdict arrived on April 11, 2023. Conditional class, valid only until her next survey, with $2.2 million in required work to renew fully. Her owners had 90 days to decide: repair or release her to the only buyers left, those who measure a ship not in dollars per charter day, but in dollars per ton of steel. By May 2023, the Sanco Harvest's owners had stopped calling shipbrokers and started calling cash buyers. Specialized trading firms like GMS or Warana that purchase vessels outright, sight unseen beyond a class report, for demolition. These buyers don't care about cargo capacity, engine hours, or charter history. They care about one number: light displacement tonnage, or LDT. The weight of the ship's steel, machinery, and equipment with no fuel, water, or cargo aboard. The Sanco Harvest's LDT was calculated at 11,400 tons. In May 2023, Indian shipbreaking yards were paying approximately $410 per LDT for bulk carriers, against $380 in Bangladesh and $395 in Pakistan. Prices that fluctuate weekly based on domestic steel demand in each country's construction sector. At $410 per ton, her scrap value came to roughly $4.67 million. Compare that to her original construction cost in 1998, $34 million. Compare it to her book value that same year, $2.1 million. The scrap sale, remarkably, exceeded her book value by more than double. Not because she'd appreciated, but because global steel and freight for recycling markets had shifted favorably that quarter. Cash buyers move fast. Within 9 days of the initial offer, GMS had inspected her class documents, confirmed her tonnage, and wired a deposit of 10% into an escrow account in Dubai. The remaining balance, per standard Norwegian sale form contracts used industry-wide, would be paid upon delivery to the buyer's nominated recycling yard. No cargo would be loaded again. No charter would be signed. The ship's final commercial identity, Sanco Harvest, bulk carrier, IMO number 9187654, would soon be erased entirely, replaced by a new name, a new flag, and paperwork designed to obscure her destination from regulators who increasingly scrutinize where end-of-life ships are sent. Her owners had made their choice: not repair, not retrofit, but release. Within 2 weeks, she would be renamed, reflagged, and crewed by a skeleton team for one final voyage. Not toward a port, but toward a beach in Gujarat, where 169,000 workers and hundreds of vessels a year meet the same fate she now sailed toward. On June 2, 2023, the vessel once known as Sanco Harvest departed Jiaoshan anchorage under a new identity. Harvest 1 flagged now to Palau instead of Panama, her IMO number technically unchanged, but her ownership routed through a single ship company registered in the Marshall Islands. a common legal buffer used to shield original owners from liability at the beach. Her crew, once 19, was now 11. A skeleton complement paid a completion bonus to sail her one last time, fully aware of the destination, though rarely told outright. No cargo insurance covered this voyage. None was needed, since her holds carried nothing but ballast water and the fuel required to reach Alang, India, 4,800 nautical miles away. Her main engine, a Sulzer 6RTA62, once capable of 13,500 kilowatts at full service speed of 14.2 knots, now ran at reduced power, 9,200 kilowatts, just enough for 11 knots, conserving her remaining fuel reserves and easing strain on machinery no one intended to repair again. Her automatic identification system transponder, tracked by maritime watchdogs like the NGO shipbreaking platform, showed her course bending southwest through the Malacca Strait, then across the Indian Ocean, avoiding weather systems not out of caution for cargo, but because a hull already condemned for corrosion couldn't risk heavy seas. 26 days at sea. No port calls, no bunkering stops beyond a single fuel transfer off Sri Lanka on June 19th. Her final position report, filed June 28th, placed her 11 nautical miles off the Gujarat coastline, awaiting high tide and a beaching slot coordinated with the yard days in advance. Aboard, the skeleton crew prepared for a maneuver few merchant sailors ever perform. Not docking, not anchoring, but deliberately running a 76,000-ton vessel at full speed onto a beach. On June 30th, at 11:40 a.m. local time, with the tide at its peak, her engine order telegraph rang for the last time, full ahead. What followed would determine everything. How cleanly she grounded, how far up the sand she traveled, and how many months it would take 400 workers to reduce her, plate by plate, to nothing but raw steel. The engine, running on its last fuel reserves, pushes the ship toward the Gujarat coastline at 9 knots. This is Alang, India, 184 plots of sand stretching 11 kilometers along the Gulf of Kampat, the largest shipbreaking beach on Earth. Timing is everything. The captain waits for the spring tide, when the moon aligns with the sun and water rises highest, sometimes 6 meters above the low water mark. At the calculated moment, full engine power is ordered, 15, sometimes 18 knots, and the vessel drives itself directly onto the sloped intertidal flat. Steel grinds against sand and clay. The hull shudders, decelerates, and stops, sometimes 300 meters from where open water began. This is not an accident. It is the method. Alang's tidal range, among the highest in the Indian Ocean, exposes the ship's underside twice daily, letting cutting crews access sections of hull that would otherwise stay submerged. Between 1983, when the first vessel beached here, and today, more than 6,500 ships have ended their lives on this shore. Bangladesh's Chattagram Beach and Pakistan's Gadani Yard use the same tidal method, though Alang alone handles roughly half of the world's annual ship demolition tonnage, over 400 vessels in a typical year. Once grounded, the ship is anchored further by winch cables threaded to onshore capstans, preventing the tide from dragging it back out as water recedes. Surveyors from the buying yard board within hours, documenting the vessel's condition, tonnage, and hazardous materials before a single door is opened. The ship that carried containers across the Pacific or grain across the Indian Ocean now sits motionless, exposed at low tide like a beached whale, its propeller and rudder visible in open air for the first time since launch. Gulls circle. Workers gather at the waterline with cutting gear staged nearby. But the beaching is only the beginning of undoing decades of construction. Before any torch touches steel, everything inside the ship that still holds value must come out, because a vessel isn't stripped of its hull first, it's stripped of its guts. Before the first hull plate is cut, crews descend into the ship's interior to extract what still has resale value. This process, called stripping, can take 2 to 4 weeks depending on vessel size, and it happens before major steel cutting begins. The engine room comes first. A single marine diesel engine, weighing anywhere from 200 to 2,000 tons depending on ship class, contains components sold separately. Turbochargers, fuel injectors, crankshafts, even entire cylinder heads. A well-maintained generator set can fetch $15,000 to $40,000 on secondary markets serving industrial buyers across South Asia and the Middle East. Navigation electronics, radar units, GPS systems, gyro compasses. are removed intact and resold to smaller coastal vessels or fishing fleets that can't afford new equipment. Lifeboats, often barely used across a ship's 25-year service life, are detached from davits and sold whole, sometimes repurposed as tourist ferries in Southeast Asia. Furniture, mattresses, galley equipment, refrigeration units, all cataloged, priced, and trucked to second-hand markets in towns like Bhavnagar, 50 kilometers from Alang's plots. Copper wiring, running in kilometers through a ship's electrical systems, is stripped and separately weighed. A mid-sized bulk carrier can yield 20 to 40 tons of copper cable alone, valued at roughly $8,000 to $9,000 per ton on current scrap markets. Brass fittings, bronze propeller components, and aluminum superstructure panels follow, each metal sorted into its own pile before export or local resale. Workers move through dark corridors with headlamps, prying loose decades of accumulated machinery, sometimes finding logbooks or crew photographs left behind in officers' quarters. By the time stripping finishes, the ship is a hollow steel shell. No engine, no wiring, no furniture, nothing but empty compartments and load-bearing structure. What remains is 90 to 95% of the vessel's original weight, all of it steel, waiting for the torches. That's when the real dismantling begins. With the interior stripped bare, cutting crews begin the ship's structural demolition using oxyacetylene gas axe torches burning at temperatures near 3,500 degrees Celsius. Work proceeds in a deliberate sequence, bow first, then hull plating along the sides, finally the stern and engine foundation. A typical bulk carrier measuring 190 meters in length is divided into sections weighing between 3 and 8 tons each. Manageable pieces that winches, powered by onshore capstans, can drag up the beach to secondary cutting zones. Crews work in teams of 4 to 6, one holding the torch while others monitor the cut line, watching for structural shifts that could cause a section to fall unpredictably. A single Panamax-class vessel, roughly 75,000 deadweight tons, yields approximately 12,000 to 15,000 tons of recyclable steel plate once fully dismantled. Steel that once formed hull, deck, and bulkheads now destined for furnaces. The process takes 3 to 6 months from first cut to final scrap pile, depending on vessel size and yard capacity. Alang's 184 plots operate simultaneously, meaning on any given day in peak season, dozens of ships in varying stages of disassembly line the beach. Some barely beached, others reduced to skeletal frames of exposed ribs and stringers. Steel sections are further cut into transportable pieces, roughly 1 meter square, loaded onto trucks bound for re-rolling mills within a 50-kilometer radius. Nothing is wasted. Even steel too corroded for direct reuse gets melted down. The economics are stark. A ship purchased for $300 to $450 per light displacement ton by a cash buyer can yield steel worth significantly more once processed, making tonnage, not condition, the only number that matters. But this transformation from vessel to raw material comes at a cost measured not in dollars, but in human safety. Because the same torches slicing through decades-old hull plating are cutting through asbestos insulation, lead paint, and trapped toxic residues that have made this beach one of the most hazardous workplaces on the planet. Shipbreaking employs an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 workers across Alang alone, most arriving from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Odisha, drawn by daily wages between 400 and 700 rupees, roughly $5 to $8 a day. The risks they face are severe and well documented. Older vessels, particularly those built before the 1990s, contain asbestos insulation wrapped around pipes and boilers, material now banned in most of the world but still present in aging hulls. Workers cutting through these sections without respirators inhale fibers linked to mesothelioma and asbestosis, diseases with latency periods of decades, meaning illness often surfaces long after a worker has left the industry. Toxic fumes from cutting lead-based paint and gases released from residual fuel oils trapped in tanks create additional respiratory hazards documented in medical surveys conducted by the NGO shipbreaking platform. Structural collapse remains the most immediate danger. Falling steel sections, some weighing several tons, have caused fatalities recorded nearly every year across South Asian yards. NGO shipbreaking platform documented 24 worker deaths in Alang alone in 2023, with dozens more injuries from falls and fires. Historically, safety equipment was minimal. Workers photographed in the 2000s wearing flip-flops and no protective gear became symbolic of the industry's neglect. Reform began gradually. The Hong Kong International Convention for the Safe and Environmentally Sound Recycling of Ships, adopted in 2009, finally entered into force in June 2025 after reaching the required ratification threshold, mandating ship recycling facility plans, hazardous material inventories, and improved worker protections. Some Alang plots have since achieved Hong Kong Convention compliance certification, installing impermeable flooring, cranes instead of manual winching, and mandatory protective equipment. Yet compliance remains uneven. Inspectors report that only a fraction of South Asia's yards meet full international standards as of 2024. The industry that recovers steel worth millions still runs, in many plots, on labor paid in dollars a day. What happens to that recovered steel next reveals the final irony of a ship's life cycle. The very metal pulled from these dangerous beaches will return, transformed, into the buildings and roads of the nations that dismantled it. The steel plates dragged off Alang's beach travel less than 50 kilometers to re-rolling mills concentrated around Bhavnagar and further inland toward Ahmedabad. There, furnaces heat the recovered plate to roughly 1,200 degrees Celsius, melting down hull sections, deck plating, and bulkhead steel that once weighed anchor in ports from Rotterdam to Singapore. The molten steel is recast, most commonly into reinforcement bars, rebar. The skeletal material inside nearly every concrete structure built across India. A single dismantled Panamax bulk carrier yielding 12,000 to 15,000 tons of steel can supply enough rebar for several mid-sized residential apartment blocks or kilometers of highway foundation. India's ship recycling industry, centered overwhelmingly at Alang, supplies an estimated 8 to 10% of the country's total steel scrap requirement, feeding a construction sector expanding to house a population exceeding 1.4 billion people. The irony completes itself here. The same nations whose workers face asbestos exposure and structural collapse on the beach are the ones whose skylines rise, quite literally, from the recycled remains of retired cargo vessels. A ship launched in 1998 for $35 million, having earned its owners tens of millions across a 25-year trading life, is purchased for demolition at $300 to $450 per light displacement ton, its scrap value rarely exceeding $12 to $18 million even for a large bulk carrier. Every system that made it valuable in service, its engine, its navigation suite, its cargo capacity, has already been stripped, sold, or discarded. What remains, what actually determines the number a cash buyer offers, what every survey, dry dock report, and IMO regulation ultimately pointed toward, is tonnage. Not horsepower, not deadweight capacity, not the decades of voyages logged in a ship's record. Just weight, multiplied by a price per ton fixed on global scrap markets that morning. From keel laying to final beaching, from millions in charter revenue to a single number quoted in dollars per ton, the entire life cycle of a cargo ship converges on one unavoidable truth. A ship's final worth is its steel.